I don't know when exactly the idea started, but for as long as I can remember, I wanted to live in Europe. Maybe it was the movies, the stories I read, or just the feeling that I didn't quite belong where I was. It wasn't just about travel, it was about starting over, about belonging somewhere else, and more than anything, I knew I wanted to work with kids. It was the one thing I was good at, the one thing that felt natural. I had a way with them. Always did. If my job didn't involve them in some way, I knew I wouldn't be happy. So when I found an au pair position in Spain, it felt like fate, a way to finally leave, to put my language skills to use, to be part of a family. Everything about it seemed perfect. The mother, Isabel, was warm and affectionate, calling me cariño from the first message. She made it sound like I was already part of their lives, like I had been meant to find them. She sent pictures, a beautiful house, two adorable kids, a life waiting for me. It was everything I had been looking for. But there was one thing, a small thing, something I brushed off at the time. She never let me meet the kids. Every time we planned a video call, something came up. One was asleep, the other was out. A last-minute change in plans. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd see them soon enough, and I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. I had pictured the arrival in my head 100 times. Stepping off the plane, scanning the crowd, spotting Isabel holding a sign with my name, her smiling, maybe giving me a quick hug before leading me to the car. That's what I had read most host families did. It was supposed to be warm, welcoming. Instead, as I was waiting near baggage claim, my phone buzzed, a message from Isabel. She wasn't coming. Something had come up at work, but her sister, Lucia, would be there to pick me up instead. I remember just staring at the text for a long moment, trying to push away that strange feeling creeping into my stomach. It wasn't a big deal. Things happened. People got busy, but still, something about it felt wrong. Maybe because I had been expecting Isabel, maybe because I was suddenly standing in a foreign airport, alone, waiting for a stranger I knew nothing about. When Lucia showed up, she was all smiles, too much warmth packed into too little time. Her energy was overwhelming, like she was trying too hard to put me at ease. The kind of person who never lets silence settle. She greeted me by name, grabbed my suitcase before I could react, and just started talking. And she never stopped talking. Not about me, though. That was the weird part. Most people, when they meet someone new, ask questions. Where are you from? How was the flight? Are you excited? But she didn't. She just filled the space with words, like silence would make something crack open. I kept telling myself I was overthinking. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe this was normal. But that feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. It didn't take long for something to feel wrong. At first, it was just a small thing. The turns weren't where I expected them to be. Before flying out, I had mapped out the route to Isabel's house, just to get a sense of it. I knew we should have been heading towards the more residential parts of the city, but almost immediately, the scenery didn't look right. The highways, the exits. We were going the opposite direction. I glanced at my phone. The location was still loading, but I could already tell this wasn't the way to the house. I tried to keep my voice casual when I asked about it. Just a simple, "Oh, is this a different way?" Like I was just making conversation. Lucia didn't even look at me. She just gave a vague little wave of her hand, muttering something about avoiding traffic, like it was the most natural thing in the world. But I noticed something then. Her grip on the wheel was just a little too tight, like she was aware I was watching her. That was when I started feeling it, that deep crawling instinct in my gut telling me something was wrong, that I needed to get out of that car, but I didn't, because at the same time there was another voice in my head, the rational one, the one that didn't want to overreact. Who was I to assume the worst? I had never even met these people in person. Maybe this was just how things worked here. Maybe I just didn't understand the roads. Maybe I was just tired. I kept telling myself that, even as the city started slipping away behind us. It took me too long to notice. I had been too focused on the road ahead, trying to piece together why we were heading in the wrong direction, trying to silence that voice in my head screaming at me that this wasn't right. But then something else started pressing at the edge of my mind. A car behind us. At first I barely registered it, just another vehicle on the road, nothing unusual. But then we switched lanes, and so did they. Once, I could ignore. Twice, maybe a coincidence. But it kept happening. Every single time Lucia changed lanes, the car followed. I felt my fingers tighten around my phone. Lucia wasn't looking at me anymore, but she was looking at the mirror. A lot. Not once, not twice, but constantly. And not in the way someone casually checks their rearview mirror. Her glances were sharp, calculated, like she was waiting for something. Something cold settled into my stomach. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting my nerves get to me, that it was just another car going in the same direction, that I was reading too much into it. But I didn't believe myself, because deep down I knew. I knew it from the way Lucia's hands gripped the wheel just a little too tightly, from the way she wasn't filling the silence anymore, wasn't trying to keep up the cheerful act, from the way the car behind us wasn't just there, it was following us. Something was wrong. I didn't want to believe it. I had spent the last half hour convincing myself that everything was fine, that I was just overthinking, that the wrong turns, the too friendly conversation, the second car were all just coincidences. But I couldn't lie to myself anymore, not when my hands were shaking, not when my stomach felt like it was twisted into knots. I tried to keep my voice steady. Take me back to the airport. Lucia didn't even blink. She kept driving, eyes fixed on the road, acting like she hadn't heard me. A sharp electric kind of panic started buzzing under my skin. I cleared my throat, said it again. Louder this time. I want to go back. Now. She let out a slow breath through her nose, like she was annoyed, like I was being difficult, like I was some kid throwing a tantrum, and she was the adult who had to deal with it, and that was it. That was the moment it all snapped into place. She wasn't going to take me back. She had never planned to take me to Isabel's house. Whatever was happening, whatever this was, if I didn't get out of that car now, I wasn't getting out at all. I don't remember thinking. I just remember moving. The next time she slowed down, I grabbed the door handle and threw my weight against it. It wasn't locked. I hit the pavement hard, my suitcase flying out behind me. And when I looked back, Lucia was just sitting there, staring at me, expression unreadable, like I was the one acting crazy. I don't know how long I stood there. The world around me felt distant, like I wasn't fully inside my own body. My hands were shaking, my breath came in short, uneven bursts. My knees ached from the fall, but I barely felt it. Lucia was still sitting in the car. She wasn't yelling at me to get back in. She wasn't driving off in a panic. She just watched, like she was waiting to see if I'd change my mind. I felt a deep, twisting nausea rise in my stomach. She had been so quick to act like I was overreacting, like I was being ridiculous. But now that I was standing on the side of the road, trembling, staring at her, she had nothing to say. The second car was gone. I don't know when it disappeared. I don't know how long it had been gone before I noticed. And I don't know what that meant. I don't think I want to know. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy and cold. I don't even remember dialing my friend's number. I don't remember what I said when they answered, just that my voice didn't sound like my own. Somehow, I made it to their place. Somehow, I got to safety. But the entire way there my mind kept looping over the same thought. If I hadn't gotten out when I did, where would I be right now? The police didn't tell me anything I didn't already know. There was no Isabel, no au pair family at that address. The photos of the children were just random images pulled from the internet. The number she used? Prepaid. Untraceable. Like she never existed at all. People keep telling me I was lucky. That's the word they use over and over, lucky. And I know they're right. I know how close I was to something I don't even want to imagine. I know how easily I could have stayed in that car, let myself believe I was being paranoid, let myself be talked down. But luck doesn't explain everything, because the worst part isn't what almost happened. The worst part is that I will never know what would have happened. Would I have woken up in some strange place, with no idea where I was? Would there have even been a place, or would I have simply disappeared? my name becoming one more footnote in a case no one could ever solve. I still ended up moving to Madrid, still ended up as an au pair, but this time through a real agency, a real family, real children, people who actually met me at the airport, like they were supposed to. And yet sometimes when I'm walking alone, I catch myself checking over my shoulder, because I don't know what they wanted. I don't know how many times they've done it before, and I don't know if someone else is still watching. I came to the US for a fresh start. That's what I kept telling myself on the plane, through customs, in the car ride to the Holloway's house. A year abroad as an au pair, new experiences, new people, a chance to finally step outside the small town I had always known. It was supposed to be exciting, something to look back on with nostalgia, but from the moment I arrived, something felt off. The Holloways had the kind of home you'd see in a magazine: tall windows, manicured lawn, an air of quiet privilege. The neighborhood itself was eerily perfect, identical houses lining empty streets. The kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. Mark and Julia Holloway were polite, welcoming even, but there was a distance to them, as if their warmth was rehearsed, reserved only for when it was necessary. Their older son, Ethan, barely looked up from his phone when I arrived, already lost in his teenage world. But Lucas was watching. Not like a shy kid sizing up a stranger. No, this was different. He stood perfectly still in the hallway, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. His eyes never left me. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was something colder, calculated. I told myself I was just nervous, that adjusting to a new country, a new family, a new job, was bound to feel strange at first. But deep down I knew something about this wasn't right. The first few weeks were normal, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I followed my schedule, settled into a rhythm. The Holloways treated me well enough, in that distant way that made me feel more like an employee than part of the household. Ethan barely acknowledged me, always lost in his phone or holed up in his room. Mark and Julia were polite but preoccupied, their lives too busy to be deeply involved. They trusted me to handle things, which I appreciated. But Lucas was different. He wasn't openly difficult. He didn't throw tantrums or talk back. It was more subtle than that, more deliberate. When I spoke to him, he would repeat my words softly, under his breath, like he was committing them to memory. Sometimes he'd be standing in a doorway, just watching, his expression unreadable. Other times I'd catch him staring at me from across the room, his lips barely moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. I told myself I was imagining things. Kids are strange sometimes, right? But it wasn't just him. It was the house too. The stillness of it. The way the floorboards didn't creak the way they should. The way the air felt too thick, pressing against my skin like a held breath. I started feeling uneasy in ways I couldn't quite put into words. Even when I was alone, I wasn't alone. There was always the sense of being watched, like something just beyond my vision was waiting for me to turn my head. And somehow I knew that if I ever did, if I ever caught it, I wouldn't like what I saw. Mornings had become routine, predictable in the way I needed them to be. Wake up before the house, get dressed, start the day. It was the small rituals: folding my blanket, making my bed, lacing my shoes, that grounded me, that made me feel like I had some control. That morning, as I slipped my foot into my shoe, I felt it immediately. A sharp, piercing pain shot up through my heel. I yanked my foot back on instinct, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought maybe I had stepped on something outside, tracked something in from the yard. But then I turned the shoe over, tilting it slightly, and they spilled out. Tiny silver sewing pins, dozens of them, clattering against the hardwood floor. My stomach twisted. I reached for the other shoe, my hands shaking slightly as I pressed a finger against the insole. More pins, buried just deep enough to stay hidden until weight pressed down on them. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something that had just happened. Someone had put them there. I swallowed hard, my mind racing for explanations. Maybe I had knocked over a box of pins. Maybe they had somehow fallen in on their own. But I didn't believe that. Not really. Across the room, Lucas was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book, calm, unbothered. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, but something about the way he sat there, too still, too composed, made my skin crawl. He hadn't moved. He hadn't needed to. And yet I knew it was him. Some afternoons felt heavier than others. It wasn't the work, cleaning, organizing, keeping things in order. That part had become automatic. It was the house itself, the way it seemed to breathe in the quiet, the way certain rooms felt colder than they should, the way the light never quite reached the corners. I was dusting the mantel when I noticed it. The family portrait. At first glance it looked normal. Mark and Julia in the center, Ethan on one side, Lucas on the other, smiling, perfect. But as I stepped closer, a strange, twisting sensation curled in my stomach. Something was wrong. The glass was scratched. Not just scratched, gouged. Deep, deliberate marks had been carved over the faces of Mark, Julia, and Ethan. Their features were obliterated, scraped away by something sharp. But Lucas was untouched. His face remained clear and sharp. His eyes locked in that frozen moment, too present, too aware. I stood there, gripping the dust cloth too tightly, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe the glass had cracked, and someone had tried to fix it. But no, the cuts were too deliberate, too focused. Someone had done this on purpose. That night, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just an old frame, just an old house, just my nerves getting the better of me. Then, as I passed the dark hallway on my way to bed, I heard it, a voice, low, murmuring, somewhere in the shadows, just beyond where my eyes could reach. I didn't stop to listen. I didn't look. I just kept walking. The smell hit me first. A sharp, sour rot, thick and cloying, cutting through the crisp afternoon air. At first, I thought maybe something had been left out. Maybe a bag of trash had been forgotten in the heat. But as I stepped outside, the scent only grew stronger. I followed it without thinking, drawn toward the back of the yard, to the place where the grass met the garden bed. The dirt looked wrong, too loose, too fresh. The kind of disturbed earth that only comes from something recently buried. I don't know why I dug. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, something instinctive, something that whispered, "You already know you won't like what you find." I dropped to my knees, pressing my fingers into the damp soil. It gave easily, crumbling beneath my touch. Then something soft. My stomach twisted. I pulled my hand back, heart hammering. For a second, I thought about leaving it, about pretending I hadn't seen, hadn't felt, but I couldn't. I dug deeper, pushing the dirt aside until the shapes beneath became clear. Birds, small, fragile bodies, dead, twisted, their legs bound together with string. A cold wave rolled through me, numbing my hands, my face. I counted at least 3 before I stopped looking. Someone had placed them here, deliberately, hidden them. I wiped my hands on my jeans, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. I could tell the Holloways. I should tell them. But as I stood there, staring down at the shallow grave, I didn't know how to begin. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to know their answer. I started locking my door. It was the only thing that gave me a sense of control, however small, however fragile. I told myself it was enough, that a locked door was a boundary, a line that couldn't be crossed. But locks don't stop everything. I don't know what woke me that night. There was no sound, no sudden movement, just a feeling, a shift in the air, a silence that felt too deep, too unnatural. My skin prickled before I even opened my eyes. And when I did, I wasn't alone. A shape beside my bed, small, still. Lucas. He stood in the darkness, close enough to touch, close enough that I could see the slow rise and fall of his breath. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then I saw it, something in his hand, something thin, something sharp, scissors. The blades hung open slightly, their dull shine catching the faint light from the window. His fingers curled loosely around the handle, as if he wasn't holding them to use them, not yet, at least, just to have them. I wanted to say something. a question, a demand, anything to break the moment. But I couldn't. And then, without a word, he turned. No hesitation, no sound, just a smooth, effortless movement as he slipped back into the shadows. The door never opened. The air never shifted. I don't know how long I stayed frozen after he left. How long I listened to the silence, waiting for it to change, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. And the worst part, when I finally gathered the courage to check the lock, it was still bolted shut. I didn't sleep. Even as the first light crept through my window, my body remained stiff, my mind trapped in an endless loop of what I had seen, what I knew I had seen. The scissors. The way Lucas moved. The way he left without a sound. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was exhausted, that stress could make people see things, make them believe things that weren't really there. But I knew. None of it mattered by morning. Julia's voice called my name, sharp, cold, not the usual distant politeness I had grown used to. I followed it into the living room, my stomach twisting before I even saw what she was holding. A bracelet, delicate, expensive looking, pearls strung together in a perfect circle, the kind of thing that belonged in a locked jewelry box, not in the open palm of my employer, not with that expression on her face. She told me she had found it in my purse. For a second, I didn't even understand what she was saying. The words made sense, but they didn't belong to reality, not my reality, because I had never seen that bracelet before. But she wasn't asking me. She was accusing me. And behind her, just beyond the doorway, he was there. Lucas. Silent. Expression unreadable. I opened my mouth to protest. But Julia had already made up her mind. The words weren't mine anymore. They had been taken from me, rewritten into something else, something I couldn't undo. I was fired on the spot. By the next day I was gone. Bags packed, ticket booked, everything over. Just like that. But it wasn't over. For months I replayed everything in my head. I wondered if I had missed something, if I had let it happen, if there had been a moment, just one, where I could have stopped it. I still wonder about Lucas. Where he is, what he's done since. I wasn't looking for anything that night. It was just another evening out, another excuse to escape the routine, something to break up the week, to feel like I wasn't just a visitor in a foreign country watching life happen around me. The bar was packed, the music was too loud, and the air carried that mix of cheap beer and too many overlapping conversations. It was familiar, predictable, background noise. Then he appeared. I don't remember him approaching in the way most guys do, all forced confidence and awkward lines. He was just suddenly there, looking at me like he already knew me. And then he said it, exactly where I was from. Not just Europe, not even just my country. He knew. He said it so casually, without hesitation, like it was a fact rather than a guess. I laughed it off at the time, maybe even a little impressed. Most people I met here never guessed right. European, sure. Maybe Scandinavian, sometimes Dutch, but never exactly right. When I asked how he knew, he just shrugged, gave some vague answer about recognizing the accent. It seemed plausible enough at the time. Later though, when I replayed it in my head, something about it felt off. It wasn't just that he had guessed, it was how sure he had been, like he had known before he even spoke to me. Like he had been waiting. At the time I ignored that feeling, brushed it away like an overactive imagination. I didn't realize it then, but that was the moment, that was the first sign that something wasn't right. His apartment was too perfect. That was the first thing I noticed. Not just clean, but curated. Everything in its place, like no one actually lived there, like it was a setup staged for a photo. No stray clothes, no empty cups on the table, no sign of the small chaos of real life. Even the air smelled neutral, like nothing had ever lingered there long enough to leave a trace. But it was the walls that caught my attention. Rows of black and white photographs, neatly arranged, each one framed with precision. At first, I assumed they were just generic landscapes, the kind you find in some cafe, dramatic skylines, cobbled streets, empty bridges shrouded in mist. But as I moved closer, a slow unease crept in. The images weren't just random cities. They were all from Germany. That alone should have struck me as odd. But it wasn't until my eyes landed on one specific photo that my stomach twisted into knots. It was my hometown. Not just some recognizable landmark, not a postcard shot of a famous square or an old cathedral. It was my exact street. The road I had walked 1,000 times, the one that led to my childhood home. I froze. How? He must have noticed my reaction because he spoke up, almost too quickly. Something about his dad collecting aerial photographs, about him picking some of his favorites to decorate his walls. The explanation should have been enough. It made sense. It was reasonable, but it wasn't. Because as much as I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. It was our first real dinner together. A proper one, not just a bar, not just late-night takeout after a long evening out. He chose a cozy Italian place, dim lighting, soft music, the kind of atmosphere that made everything feel effortless. As we sat down, he smiled and said, "I picked this place for you. They have amazing vegetarian options." It was such a small thing, harmless even. Most people wouldn't think twice about it. But something about the way he said it, like he already knew, like he had planned for it, made my skin prickle. I smiled, nodded, played along. Maybe I had mentioned it in passing. Maybe he had overheard me talking about it with friends. I tried to push the thought away, but it stuck. Later that night, when I was back in my room, I found myself scrolling my Instagram, my old posts, searching for an answer to a question I hadn't even fully formed yet. And then I found it. One post, years ago, a blurry picture of a meal, nothing special. The caption, a throwaway mention of trying to eat vegetarian, buried beneath dozens of other posts, something no one would ever pay attention to. But he had. I stared at the screen, my pulse slow and heavy. This wasn't casual curiosity. He had gone through my history, far back. He had been looking, and suddenly I wasn't sure what else he had found. I shouldn't have looked. I know that. There's a certain line you don't cross, even in the early stages of dating, especially then. But something about him had started feeling too perfect, too tailored. Like every moment, every gesture was calculated for the best possible reaction. So when he fell asleep next to me, breathing slow and steady, I reached for his phone. His passcode wasn't hard to remember. He hadn't exactly been careful about hiding it. My heart pounded in my ears as I swiped through his apps, feeling like I was balancing on the edge of something I wasn't ready to fall into. Then I saw it. A folder, tucked away in his camera roll, titled Wife. I opened it, expecting I don't even know what. But not this. Screenshots of my Instagram, so many. My posts, my captions, my tagged locations, even my stories. Stories that disappeared after 24 hours. Stories I didn't even remember posting. But he did. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I scrolled. It didn't stop there. His notes app. Lists of places I'd been. Translations of old captions. A rough schedule of when and where I usually went out, pieced together from months of observation. Then, the worst part, a photo of my driver's license. I stopped breathing. The realization hit all at once, like a slow, creeping sickness in my gut. The night I lost my wallet at that frat party. The second night I had gone out in America. That's how he found me. That's how he knew everything. I locked his phone with shaking hands. I had to leave. It was my second night out in the US. Just another party, another blur of faces and music and cheap beer. I didn't even realize my wallet was missing until the next morning when I reached for it and found nothing. I barely thought about it. Stuff like that happens. I canceled my cards, got a new ID, and moved on. It was just one of those little inconveniences, a hiccup in the grand scheme of adjusting to a new country. At least, that's what I told myself. But now it all lined up. My ID, my full name, my face, my birthday, my address back home frozen in a tiny plastic rectangle. He had it. That's how he found me. I thought back to that first night when he guessed exactly where I was from. The way he said it, without hesitation, like it was a fact he had always known. It wasn't intuition. It wasn't a lucky guess. The way he picked a restaurant with vegetarian options without me ever telling him. The way he had a framed photo of my hometown like it was just part of some innocent collection. None of it was a coincidence. Not him. Not the way he approached me. Like we were old friends reuniting. Not the way he always seemed to know just a little too much. And the worst part, I had never questioned it. Not really. I had brushed it off, let it slide, convinced myself I was overthinking. But I wasn't. I wasn't overthinking at all. I left without making a sound. Didn't breathe, didn't look back. Just grabbed my bag and walked fast, steady, like I wasn't about to fall apart. My hands didn't stop shaking the whole drive home. My mind screamed at me to do something. Take screenshots, grab evidence, tell someone. But all I could think about was getting out. Just away. Away from that apartment. Away from him. I blocked him on everything before I even stepped through my door. Social media, my phone, email, anything that had a trace of me. I changed passwords, locked down accounts, scrolled through my settings to make sure nothing was public. But it didn't matter. He still had my name, my face, my information, and I had nothing. No proof, no messages to point to, no way to explain why the fear sat in my chest like a weight, just my gut, screaming at me that something wasn't right. For days I kept waiting, waiting for the next move. Every time my phone lit up, my heart stopped. Every knock on the door made my stomach drop. I barely slept. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his apartment, the pictures, the folder on his phone, the way he looked at me like he already knew how this story ended. I had left, but it didn't feel over. Weeks passed. I told myself it was over, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I got away in time. Then I started seeing it. The same silver car parked across the street. Not every day, not always in the same spot, but often enough that my stomach twisted every time I stepped outside. I told myself it was just paranoia, until I caught a glimpse of the driver, just a shadow behind the glass. But something in my body knew, and then came the messages. Not threats, not anger, just requests. Fake numbers, burner accounts. Can we talk? I just want to explain. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Somehow that made it worse. I changed my number, tightened my privacy settings, kept my curtains drawn at night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it mattered. So now I'm building a case, screenshotting everything, saving messages, writing down dates and times. I keep telling myself I'll go to the police, that I'll explain everything. But I've heard how these things go. No direct threats, no clear danger. Just a gut feeling, just fear that I can't quite prove. And my time here is running out. My visa is almost up. Soon I'll be back home, an ocean away. I just hope I can leave this behind.